Welcome to Spirits Podcast, a boozy dive into mythology, legends, and folklore. Every week we pour a drink and learn about a new story from around the world. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Julia.
And this week we are joined by the inimitable Sacha Coward, an author, a educator, a escape room designer. We could probably do 8 episodes with you about all the cool things you do. But more to the point, you are a queer person who loves myths and legends, and you're publishing a book all about them. So we knew it was a crossover that must happen.
Absolutely.
Thank you for making me sound so interesting. That's really flattering. Yeah, and thank you for having me on the show. It should be a really fun chat.
To get us started, Sacha, can you tell people about the book?
Yeah, so I've just written my first book called Queer as Folklore. I'll be really honest, the pun on the title, Queer as Folklore, came first, and then I basically wrote a book around it. But it's about looking at folklore, mythology, monsters, myths and legends from an LGBTQ plus perspective. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, and all the other identities that fall under that spectrum. So the book goes chapter by chapter with a different mythical creature. So from unicorns, vampires, mermaids, witches, all the way through to modern folklore. So I include superheroes, robots and aliens as being examples of contemporary folklore and looks at it through that lens. I guess for me, the reason for writing this book is I'm a queer person, and like many queer people, I'm obsessed with myths and legends and have been since I was a child. I've noticed that I'm definitely not alone in that. So if you go to a gay pride parade anywhere in the world, you will see mermaid fancy dress, you will see unicorn horns, you will see fairy wings, you will see animal tails, t-shirts with werewolves on it, you name it. It's something we just cling to so easily. And I guess for a long time I thought, well, that's just because they're fabulous and we're fabulous and we like things that are a bit strange and a bit different. But then through working at museums, I've kind of realized that actually goes much deeper. So I wanted to explore not just now, but going back hundreds and even thousands of years, what is it about these creatures and these ideas, these supernatural entities, that connect so well with the queer experience? And that's kind of where the book came from.
I know that is an intersection that our listeners are going to really enjoy, and I highly encourage them, as I will throughout this entire episode, to check out the book. Sacha, you mentioned you liked these kind of creatures and these stories from a very early age, and you thought it's just because they're fantastic. But, there was a deeper meaning within you. Do you remember the first kind of story or creature or just mythological origin story that you have that you really latched onto? Because I know for me, it was the story of Artemis and Athena in Edith Hamilton's mythology. And I'm like, oh, these are women that I want to be like. And then I was like, oh, wait, that explains so much about me as a person. Okay, cool. That checks out. What was that for you?
Well, yours is so wonderful and academic. Mine's really silly.
No, I want it.
So mine's Disney's The Little Mermaid. And I had the VHS. I'm that old, just aged myself perfectly. There were certain bits that, again, at that age, your concept of identity is still forming. It's still very fluid. So I wasn't going, oh, I want to be Ariel. Or it was more like something about Ursula, something about that story was just captivated me. Yeah, I was a little gay boy. Didn't know that yet, but I was. But I wasn't drawn to Sleeping Beauty or a lot of the other ones. I was obsessed with The Little Mermaid, and particularly by Ursula and the baddie in it. So I watched the bit of Poor Unfortunate Souls so many times that bit of the VHS kind of stretched, and the video was all woo, warped. And and then I guess I didn't.
We're at that tape.
Yeah, exactly. But I kind of, from then on, I became obsessed with Greek myths like you. I was really, really into Greek myths. So I had this, I think it was called the Orchard Book of Greek Myths, an illustrated copy of Greek myths. And if I'm honest, it had all of the good queer stuff taken out. Thank you, the Victorians. But it was still really compelling. And the one story I remember really loving, because it was kind of sad and interesting, was the story of Echo and Narcissus. and the tragic origin of these two tragic characters, and then one of them becomes the flower that gazes at himself eternally, and one is cursed to only ever have the last word, so she becomes an echo. And I think from then on it just spiraled, and any sort of story that particularly was a bit dark, but had that sort of like, particularly with hybrid creatures or curses, I was always drawn to. And then it wasn't really until I was like an adult that I kind of put that together with my queer identity and realized, yeah, there's something that connects these two things together. So yeah, mine was Disney of all things. I wish it was like a proper queer reading of a mythology, but no, it was Disney.
But no, the Disney stuff makes so much sense because so many of the Disney villains during that time period particularly were queer coded, which is why like nowadays, like queers our age are so into the Disney villains because we're like, well, we're seeing ourselves kind of as that. And I really kind of love that your first kind of like mythology love story that you fell in love with is one that has a tragic ending. Because again, like kind of, even if you hadn't identified yet as queer, and especially like growing up in like the 80s and 90s and like early 2000s, knowing that like any love story that you personally have will probably end in tragedy because that's the only type of story that we could see for queer people at the time, that makes so much sense. And like, not even just trying to read into it with like, like hindsight, that's just like how it was back then,
Yeah, I think that particularly when I grew up, so I grew up towards, I was born at the later stages of the HIV pandemic, particularly affecting kind of gay men, trans women, obviously across the queer community. But I wasn't really aware of it all that much until I got like into my like late childhood, early teens. But the framing in that sort of late 90s, early 2000s, as I discovered that I was gay, there was no depiction of a same-sex love story that was either like came to a happy ending or a stable ending. It always was either framed around one of the people coming out and receiving just horrendous abuse, or one of them dying, quite possibly of HIV. So I guess maybe on some level I internalized this kind of like tragic love is the only love that I can connect with. So there's definitely an element of that. I also think that Ursula, if you know anything about the story of the Disney film itself, so adapted from Hans Christian Andersen, and we can go into that. He's a whole story himself. But you've got this, being created in response to a drag queen. So the design of Ursula was based on Divine, who was a drag queen from the 1970s. When you watch Ursula in the film, she's putting her makeup on in the mirror, the way she moves and sways her hips and uses language. When I was 21 or 22 and I went to my first drag show, like something went like connected. And I sort of realized like what I'd seen, I was watching a drag show on that VHS. That was drag. I just didn't have the vocabulary for it.
I feel like my initial response would have been like, why are all of these drag queens doing Ursula impressions? And then like it would have clicked later on being like, oh, wait, no, it's the opposite.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. I remember going to this tiny little gay bar in Camden Town in London, and it's now closed, sadly, called the Black Cat. And I saw one of the first drag shows I ever saw was inspired by the evil queens of Disney. So they was dressed up as, the queen from Snow White, Maleficent, Ursula, and like, yeah, you kind of, again, the connection seems quite obvious, like on the surface level. They're iconic, they're dark, they're fabulous, they're imposing, the costumes are really over the top. But then like there's even more when you talk about that queer coded thing. You're talking about like the history of cinema, right? So why are Disney villains queer coded, and why are so many villains queer coded?
Yeah.
And you're talking about like, the guidelines that were basically used to format cinema through the 1950s, which meant that you couldn't express queerness other than as the monster. So, there's a reason. It's not just that they're cool and fun and sparkly. there's something also more interesting that you can get your teeth into, which I find really compelling and fascinating. And then if we're talking about The Little Mermaid, you've got Disney, like Howard Ashman, who was a gay man, worked on Disney, tragically passed away of HIV. He put something of himself into that. And then you have Hans Christian Andersen, who created the original Little Mermaid story, which is a very different beast. It's a real tragedy. She doesn't get the prince at the end. She turns into sea foam. You know, every step she takes are like treading on broken glass. And that was written by a queer man. And suddenly you get the more you dig into it, and it's not just queer men, you have lesbian artists, you have depictions of Sappho of Lesbos being depicted as mermaids. And then that's when basically I became, you know, the meme where he's like sticking up all the crazy things on the wall on their string and he's like pointing at it. Yeah, like the conspiracy theory meme. Just Google conspiracy theory meme and you'll get the image. That's me, but it's covered in like unicorns and mermaids. I'm like, no, seriously, you guys, there's something going on here. And that was the framing of the book. And then through researching the book, I found like it wasn't just a Little Mermaid. It was so much more.
I always love asking, especially when authors and researchers are really deep diving, conspiracy boarding. What was the thing that you discovered in your research that surprised you the most? Like what little like fun fact or tidbit like sent you on the most like of a rabbit hole research spiral?
Okay, so I guess it was something that I just hadn't looked into until the publisher had taken on the book. And I was like, all right, okay, I have some ideas, but let's look at this other stuff. I was like, is there enough in, let's say, aliens? Let's look at aliens. And I went down the rabbit hole with that. The coolest thing for me was finding out that what is often argued to be the very first alien story. Now, obviously, this is highly contentious because how do you define an alien? Were the ancient Greek gods aliens? You can get into like a whole thing. And I'm not talking like Netflix conspiracy theory, but more like creatures from other worlds. Is that what you need to be an alien, or do they have to be on the planet, etc.? But people often talk about the story by Lucian of Samosata called True Story. And the very first aliens, like creatures on another planet that they encounter are gay because there are no women and they reproduce with each other by giving birth through their legs, because obviously. And the whole thing is like the guy played by Lucian, it's like a self-insert fantasy. This is like ancient Greek fanfic. He basically saves the day, and the leader of these hunky alien men gives his son away as a gift to marry the male main character, who's like, oh no, I couldn't. And you're like, wow, that's the first alien.
I couldn't possibly.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, this is so Wattpad coded, you know? Like,
yes.
This is like the golden age of fanfic. This is a bit Mary Sue even. But the whole thing for me is like, wow, at the very conception of science fiction, like some of the earliest stuff we might call science fiction has this really clear queer reading. And then that was the big spiral for me. Like, aliens are gay, like running around to my poor husband. Did you realize that the first alien was gay? How do I not know this? So that was probably a real thing. But it was just like, it was full of those little moments, because I guess what I found, this is going to sound very pretentious and overly profound, but whilst researching this as someone who's obsessed with queer, like with mythical creatures who's queer, I kept seeing myself reflected in the past. Look, there's this, this lesbian woman from the 19th century who's obsessed with spirits. There is this artist who's painting mermaids. There's this like poet from the 15th century writing horny poetry about unicorns. Like, oh, and I just kept finding myself in different forms over and over again, and being like, oh, it's not like I've had this eureka moment, I'm the first one to realize this. I'm on your podcast because you kind of already know that this is like a truism, that mythology and folklore have this queerness to them. And so it just felt like this was like I was just part of a lineage of people having the same response.
I think that is absolutely the case. And again, that is why you're here on the show, is because humans have always kind of had this through line of telling stories about themselves and being able to kind of explain the world by telling these stories through mythology and folklore. And because there have always been queer people, you know, regardless of culture across the world and how that was portrayed or viewed, we're always going to have a version of queer folklore because humans are queer in some capacity, and therefore folklore and mythology always have to be.
Yeah, it's this interesting thing because there's two reasons why I feel like we're so overly represented, I would argue, in this field. And like one is what you said, like, you know, queer history is just history. So everything humanity touches is queer because queer people exist. So, you know, you could look at anything through a queer lens and you would find something there. So that's part of it. Like, of course we're there. We have to be there because we've always been there, and so we're there. And then for me, there's the other stuff. It's like, why are, you know, again, they would not have used the word queer, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans 100, 200 years ago. I'm very aware of that. But people whose lives seem to fit those descriptions like eerily well, why are they so overly represented amongst the authors, the creators, the storytellers, you know, all the custodians of mythology and queer history is fascinating to me. And so I think it's not just that we're there because we're always there. It's also there's something about being queer or different, if you want to talk about it, that allows us to be such great curators and creators of mythology and folklore.
I've said versions of this before, but like imagining a safe, vibrant, queer adulthood and a society that supports that is often science fiction, right? Like it's often speculative fiction. It's fantasy. You know, however close that different societies get or that we may get in the future, I hope it becomes less and less of an imaginative leap. But to me, you know, growing up queer requires imagination to survive. And that's what makes us excellent artists. And I think that's what makes other kinds of speculative societies of what if this variable was different? What if this, you know, society was structured around or valued something totally different to what it does? Even if we're talking about like hard science fiction where like the minerals on Earth, right, or on a different planet are different to the ones that we have, and it's not carbon and it's something else. And then like all the life forms are different. Something about that is so queer to me. To me, it is just like, it is such an obvious pairing and something that we have to be good at and find a lot of comfort in.
Yeah, I think I have these two things that resonate with that. So one is like, I think queer people are natural born time travelers. And what I mean is not literally Doctor Who, although thank you, Doctor Who, for wonderful queer representation recently.
Yeah.
But the fact that because we often can't find ourselves and our role models in the present, in the here and now, we have to look back to ancient history. We have to look back, or we have to create worlds in the future where we theoretically could exist. So if we just look at the language that we use, so lesbian, right? We're talking about the Isle of Lesbos where Sappho lived. If we're talking about homosexual or transgender, we're using Latin and Greek to describe ourselves because the here and now never feels stable, but the past, maybe the past has these frameworks that we can understand. And then the flip side is science fiction. We create our own future worlds. And I think like you look into the 1800s and gay men were talking, they weren't using the word gay as commonly or the word homosexual. They spoke about it as being Greek love. That was a description. And so I think naturally we're always traveling in time by reading and by studying. We're escapists, right? That's what we do. And then I guess like the other thing is that thing you spoke about being different and therefore being able to understand difference, is that to be queer for me, the superpower is that it's almost like Wizard of Oz. You get to see behind the curtain because like I was told what being a man meant, you know, and I was told what being a woman meant, and I didn't do those things. I didn't love that way. And so you suddenly realize these structures that you're told, or these systems that you're told, like this is just how it is. You sort of peer behind it, and behind the curtain, you can see the reality. And so I think somehow that allows you to be quite good at, going, what if? But what if on another world, or what if in a different planet or a different universe? It gives you that ability. So yeah, I definitely agree with you there.
I also think that that's a really interesting route to go down as well, because, and I've seen plenty of articles we've talked about on the show before, but like queer people often see themselves or relate to monsters and creatures and stuff like that. We can go with the unicorn, you can go with the mermaid, you can go with all of that kind of stuff. But like even people, falling in love with the Babadook and being like, this is a new queer icon, the Babadook. It's this idea that if the world is going to other us and see us as monsters, we might as well embrace the monstrous parts of us. And I think that that's really interesting, because I think that that's something that we've been doing since ancient Greek times. Like we like have plenty of stories about like trans people in Greek mythology. We have plenty of stories of these like women that were turned into monsters or into other things because they didn't conform with society or bend to those in power. And I think that there is something that we can look at that and say like, oh, that is our experience. That's why we relate to it. And I really love that you compared us to time travelers, because I think that the fact that we can recognize ourselves in these stories and in history so apparently is always a skill set that we have had even in the Victorian era, earlier Renaissance age, you know. And I really love that about talking about mythology in the frame of queerness.
Yeah, I think those hybrid creatures, they're often meant as like warnings, right? So they're kind of like moral lessons of what happens when you break the rules. Medusa becomes a monster. It's not her fault, but because she breaks the rules, she desecrates, even though we know it's not her choice, that a temple. And we know that, mermaids, they can be a lesson on don't be vain, women, or to men, don't trust beautiful women. There's all kinds of lessons. And because so many mythical creatures are based on like what happens when you break the rules, when just by existing, your existence breaks the rules, that's where you see yourself most easily in those creatures. And I also think there's another side, which is, okay, if you're going to be a monster, if you have to be a monster because that's how you're cast in society, I want to be a beautiful monster. I want to be a fabulous monster, and I want to rework the understanding. So it's not surprising to me, like someone like Hans Christian Andersen, who was bisexual, basically he was brokenhearted after writing all these love letters to this man he adored, and basically being told, sorry, mate, I don't feel the same way. How does he find expression of his heartbreak? And the mermaid, which is a creature that's normally perceived only for having like a voracious, monstrous, lustful appetite, he's reframed her as like an innocent young thing who falls in fated love. And so, of course, it's a queer voice that recontextualizes these creatures. Like, that makes perfect sense to me. But also, like, unicorns, originally they were monstrous. They were frightening creatures. They looked like weird goat creatures that breathed fire in some manuscripts. So we can create them as beautiful with wonderful manes. And fairies were cruel tricksters, but we can make them gorgeous. So there's a sense of reclaiming and going, well, if we're going to be this thing, just like we reclaimed the word queer, we're going to reclaim these images and we're going to make them so cool and so enticing, you're going to want to be part of it as well. That's a very queer thing for me.
My favorite part, too, about the unicorns in particular, just because we recently did an episode on that, is it was such a fundamentally like Christian image by the time that you're talking about like medieval and then Renaissance era. And then the gays were like, nah, bitch, this is ours. The Catholics don't get to keep this. This is ours now.
So my perspective on unicorns is they've shifted. So like they started off as this really sexual pagan, the horn is a phallus, it's a penis, right? That's what it symbolizes. And they were representative of like male lust and uncontrollable male lust. So they could only be tamed by a virgin woman, and they're literally horny creatures, right? Then like the Victorians and those a little bit earlier get their hands on them, and they try to turn them into royal heraldry. So the Christian iconography, the pure white, the perfect, powerful, gorgeous comes into play. But this is the classic thing, right? If you make something really pretty, if you go a little bit too far, we've got a word for it. It's called camp. And it becomes too much. And suddenly the mermaid is like, it's got so much jewelry. It's so sparkly that like most self-respecting, heterosexual men are like, ooh, that's a bit much. I think, I won't be sticking that on my flag. That's a bit embarrassing. And so the queers obviously are like, we'll have that. That's ours now. Thank you very much. Don't worry. We love it.
Somehow the unicorn has pecs, and like I'm into it. I'm here for it.
Oh, don't get me onto like furries. I basically that was another rabbit hole I went down. I was writing about werewolves. So one of the chapters is about werewolves and transforming animals. And I actually had to edit out. I had like so much stuff about furries. It's now become condensed a little bit, but it's like, are furries like the contemporary version of like shape-shifting Vikings? That was like my wild little thing. But yeah, the sexy animal, like literally sexy beasts, are something that not just queer people, but particularly queer people have resonated for a long time. And it's funny that now, for a while, people very much have been looking down on furries. They've been like the butt of the joke, right? Oh, you're ruining it for everyone. Oh, that's gross. Like, do you actually fancy animals? Is this bestiality? And you can kind of look back at history and go, humans have always had this kink. Like, if we're talking about that particular mixing of animal and sex, I'm afraid you're talking about human history right there. That's something we've done for a long time.
I mean, the animal husband and the animal wife are both like recurring themes in not only mythology, but like particularly in fairy tales, like to the point where they are like an archetype in the ATU index that you can easily find like, oh, there's the animal husband and then the bird wife. Like these are like such common things that they are like, they're shorthand for them. You know what I mean? So like it's been around for a while. It's not new. And the furries also run the internet, like literally. So who are we to judge them?
Like, this sounds so lame. Some of my best friends are furries. But like, no, really, like, it's a community that I think I'm really proud.
Yeah.
not that I can claim this, because sadly I'm not a furry myself. But I've seen this being a group that was so vilified. And they have done, just like queer people, and many, to be honest, this is part of my thing, there's a real high number of queer people in the furry community. But they've managed to turn that round and kind of just like laugh it off and turn the joke back on the people mocking them to the point like, you want to be creative on the internet, you better make friends with the furries because they are everywhere and they know things. Like they are our sages.
They are. Like I would feel so safe like asking a furry for help at a Comic-Con. Like I just feel like to a person basically they are like lovely, here to help, and probably know where I can like park or get a coffee or charge my phone.
No, when we went to that one con, Amanda, in Austin, we were getting set up on the stage to do a live show. We were doing a werewolf roundup kind of thing, and all the like stage hands, the guys running all the tech and stuff like that came up and they're like, by the way, like the entire tech crew are all like furries and a lot of us are like wolf personas. And I'm like, that's awesome. I'm so glad that we appealed directly to you guys with this.
Yeah.
one.
And then afterward they were like, nice job. And we were like, oh, thank you. As long as they had fun, that's what matters.
As long as they're happy.
The thing that I was sort of touched upon in the book, because we don't go deep into it, but like, queer people, not all furries are queer, but a lot of furries are queer. And like, that's a really interesting connection. Like, I'm not saying that people have, wolf personas because they're gay or they're trans. But those two concepts, again, once you've stepped like behind the scenes of that big stage play that is like heteronormativity, Like, you can play with all the props. You realize it's all just like cardboard. You can go like, well, screw this. I'll do this, and this makes me feel good, and doesn't hurt anyone. So I think there is an interesting thing there. The fun thing for me, and maybe I'm not the person to. I think there's a whole book here that isn't the book for me to write, but is like really drawing in those connections of like animal mythology and paganism through to the modern day furry, and seeing that as a singular line, I think is really interesting. But like, werewolves have been perceived as sexy for so long. Like, the wolf is such like, I'm gonna get so, don't clip this out of context. The wolf is such a sexy animal, right? Like, it's just it's a symbol that has become so used that we understand it. Like, from Little Red Riding Hood, it's a dangerous, sexy animal.
Yeah, we want to be devoured, right?
Yeah, and like, even like, not just in in Europe. Like, look at the kitsune in Japan. You have like shape-shifting, sexy foxes, or raccoons. So it is interesting to me that like you can draw this line. So I'm all furry power is not something I expected to find myself saying on the podcast, but yeah, I think it's interesting how queer people get to play with ideas and go to places that are taboo, because you've kind of realized that it's all BS anyway, because your life, for no choice of your own, you've been born into an existence that just breaks the rules, and the rules are broken, and the world doesn't end, and you can still fall in love, and you can still live, and you suddenly realize then, well, what are those rules, and why are they there?
I love that. I want to talk more about those rules, why they're there, and how we can break them. But first, why don't we really quickly grab a refill?
Let's do it.
Hey, this is Julia, and welcome to The Refill. Let's start, of course, by thanking our news patrons. Thank you so much to Hannah and Ronnie for joining us at patreon.com/spiritspodcast. You can get some cool rewards by signing up at patreon.com/spiritspodcast, including show notes for every episode, recipe cards for every episode, ad-free episodes, and so much more. Check it out one more time. That is patreon.com/spiritspodcast. And hey, you can join the ranks of our supporting producer level patrons like Alicia, Ann, Ariana, Ginger Spurs Boy, Hannah, Jack Marie, Jane, Nieselkins, Lily, Matthew, Phil Fresh, Rico, like Captain Jonathan, Malachi Cosmos, Sarah, and Scott, and of course our legend level patrons. Audra, Bex, Chibi Yokai, Jeremiah, Morgan H, Sarah, and Beam Me Up Scotty. And hey, I have a book recommendation for you this week. It is The Dead Take the A Train by Richard Kadri and Cassandra Kaw. It is a really interesting, kind of scary, kind of body horror-y sort of book. The way that it was described to me is Neil Gaiman meets Jessica Jones with magic, monsters, and mayhem. And honestly, what's not to love about those things? If you like dark, kind of spooky stuff, I think you will like this book. That is The Dead Take the A Train. So check that out. And if you click the link in our show notes, you'll see that it takes you to our bookshop.org, where you can purchase this and support your local indie bookstore, which is always so, so important. And hey, if you wish you had more Multitude shows to catch up on, good news! Members of the Multi-Crew get a whole RSS feed full of bonus audio, including both Head, Heart, Gut, which is our friendly debate show, and our newest show, which is the Multi-Crew Review. So Head, Heart, Gut is we take a item or a thing from pop culture or the world we live in, and we debate each other on which is actually the best of those things. We've done some wild stuff. This month is Best Reptile, which I am arguing as a part of, and let me tell you, I have never been angrier in my life at my coworkers in the best and funniest way possible. So check that out. Go to multicrew.club today to sign up and join the Multi-Crew and get shows like Multi-Crew Review and Head, Heart, Gut. You're gonna love it. And this episode is sponsored by Shaker and Spoon, one of our oldest and most adored sponsors. Now, Shaker and Spoon is a subscription cocktail service that helps you learn how to make handcrafted cocktails right at home. If you listen to this show, you know I'm a bit of a mixologist, an amateur mixologist. I like to dabble at home. And part of the reason that I love doing that so much is because I have had such incredible experiences with shaker and spoon. Now, here's how it works. Every box comes with enough ingredients to make 3 different cocktail recipes developed by world-class mixologists. All you need to do is buy 1 bottle of that month's spirit, and you have all you need to make 12 drinks at home. So if it's a gin month, let's say, you buy your favorite bottle of gin, and then you're making 12 gin cocktails right at home. And at just $40 to $50 a month, plus the cost of a bottle, it is a super cost-effective way to enjoy craft cocktails. Like, I don't know about you, but in New York, and when I go out for a cocktail, it is like minimum $14 a cocktail. So you're really saving money by using shaker and spoon at home. And, you know, you can also skip and cancel boxes anytime, which I think is really useful for my kind of wild schedule. So invite some friends over, class up your nightcaps, or be the best house guest of all time with your shaker and spoon box. Get $20 off your first box at shakerandspoon.com/cool. Again, that's shakerandspoon.com/cool. And now let's get back to the show. We're back, and Sacha, I always love asking our guests what you have been enjoying drinking lately, whether that's cocktails, mocktails, coffee creations, etc. What has been your drink of choice lately?
So me and my husband have been enjoying a whiskey recently. I have to admit, up until about like 5 years ago, I was one of those people that I liked my alcohol like really fruity and really sweet and really hidden, right? And I'm only starting relatively recently to just enjoy the burn. Like, we've been drinking Stranahan's, which is a whiskey that's from Colorado. Another really cute thing is when it's being put in the bottle, they stick on what song they're listening to. So they write the music that they've been listening to whilst it's bottled. And like, that's just nice, because like you pour yourself a glass and you're like, oh, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, or whatever. And it's so
I love that.
That's really nice. I guess the other thing, and this is very pretentious, is a new bar has opened up in Stroud, and it's a chocolate bar that has cacao. So we went for cacao, and that is gorgeous. It's like adult hot chocolate. So good.
I love that. That
Amazing.
sounds incredible. Oh my gosh. So we spent the first half of this talking a lot about mythology and folklore, particularly like ancient mythology, a lot of monsters and stuff like that. But I know the book also touches on less like fantastical folklore and more on like folklore of the modern day.
Yeah.
And I know you talk about pirates, which is one of my favorite topics. Do you want to talk a little bit about cross-dressing pirates?
I would love to. Nothing would bring me more joy. So I used to work at the National Maritime Museum in London, and it's one of the few places you can guarantee that you will be surrounded by mermaids and pirates.
Yes.
Other than the Gay Pride Parade, obviously. So pirates, I think, is one of those things that people might be surprised to see them appear in a folklore book. One of the interesting things about pirates is, whilst they are like a historical fact, and there are literally pirates today, pirates like are real, at the same time, the pirates that we read about have been so mythologized that mostly they're not real, or at least they're so tangentially inspired by reality that they have become their own mythology. During like the kind of 1600s through to the 1800s, there has been an obsession around pirates, but so much of it was written in fantasy, in like accounts. Like, there's a great book called A History of the Pirates with a Y in the word pirates. That's how old it is.
Ooh.
It's like, how much of this is true? How much of this is just gossip around, the bar, and how much of it is a hybrid of the two? So pirates are like this mythical being with a sprinkle of truth. So that's the kind of the framing I've put, that a lot of what we think about pirates, is from Treasure Island. It's from all of these books and this literature that's been created around it. The thing for me is, as soon as you go to sea, everything gets very queer. Like the classic thing is like the phrase that's been used to describe pirates is rum, sodomy, and the lash. And that was a phrase that has been known for a long time to describe a life at sea.
Wow.
Because you go to sea and we'll get onto this, officially they are, they're believed to be homosocial or single sex spaces. Now, we know that's not actually true, but let's imagine this. They're believed to be lots of men in one space. So straight away, you have a wonderful space for explorations of homosexuality and bisexuality, because you've taken a lot of men living on the edge of society for whatever reason, and you've suddenly sent them out to sea. That's interesting. The next thing is that the laws that would apply on land don't apply necessarily at sea, because, whilst you may be coming from England, let's say you bring those laws with you, when you're a captain at sea, you just need that ship to function. And sometimes, you may allow certain things, or certain things may take place literally, below board or below deck that, wouldn't be allowed to happen on land. And the people going to sea, particularly for something like piracy, a lot of that is around escapism. So you're trying to escape the society you've come from for a different kind of life. The classic example is the cross-dressing pirate. And this is where you get into like a really murky land when it comes to pronouns, because history doesn't care about your sensitivity, and you end up becoming clumsy because you're trying to work out how people thought about themselves inside their own heads based on like second-hand and third-hand retelling. But the likes of Anne Bonny, for example, and I will use she, her, because we know at like the bookends of her life, that's how she referred to herself. But a non-binary reading of Anne Bonny is really valid and really interesting. And we know that she was described as being raised as a boy, but then marrying a man, deciding that she didn't want to be with this man. She wanted to be with the pirate Jack Rackham instead, and went off to sea as a pirate in drag, or in an attire that she/they were comfortable with. And then living this way, they come across another young cabin boy who, despite being with the pirate Jack Rackham, they become quite enamored with, because he's very good looking. And lo and behold, this young cabin boy finally reveals themselves to say, actually, I have to reveal I am not in fact a boy. I am Mary Read. So you now have Anne Bonny in drag and Mary Read in drag, both about to hook up together. I don't know what reading you put on this, but it's not heterosexual. Like whatever's going on here, whatever gender bending magic is happening, it's far from heterosexual. To the point that the story describes that Jack Rackham, the pirate that Anne fell for, becomes jealous and threatens to kill Mary in drag until Mary reveals themselves to be Mary. So it's wonderful. It's like a Shakespeare play. And there's a lot of things like this where clothes are changing all the time. Both Anne and Mary are described as being fearsome pirates. So if you want to see them as like powerful women pirates, yeah, that's a great reading. They are respected, they're feared, they hold their own until they're finally arrested at the end, whereas they're put to death, but both of them plead the belly, which means that they're saying that they're pregnant. And then sadly, the story from then gets a bit convoluted. We don't quite know what happens to them. But you have this, again, incredibly gender-bending, transgressive lifestyle. And we see this happening all over the place, in every direction, in every way you can imagine. The idea of pirates engaging in sodomy, what it was referred to at the time, in same-sex relationships between men, is so discussed that there are 2 whole academic books written just on the subject. This is not something that I've just made up or dragged from the ether. It's something that was kind of known. Like, one man wrote, I think it was in the 1700s, that one of the reasons people became pirates was due to conviction of, fleeing fire and faggotry. The idea that, again, what might lead you to become a pirate? Now, what I will say is, the reality of being a pirate was a deeply unsafe thing, because, most of these people were criminals, and they weren't just drinking rum and singing songs. They were killing people. They were killing women. They were killing each other. They were doing so the reality is let's talk about the lovely, glossy, fancy dress pirate, that we can enjoy that. But we also have to realize that the reality was these were queer spaces, but they were very dangerous spaces. And they weren't necessarily beautiful, permissive. This is not a Mykonos pride parade. This is basically like a prison ship. So like things were happening that were not okay as well. And that's the interesting thing with pirates, is you have like the fantasy pirate that's like the cover of a Mills and Boon novel, lovely gay pirates, cross-dressing pirates, wonderful. And then the real pirates that were also doing terrible things. So that they're a fascinating group of people to explore, particularly like around the 1600s and 1700s, as this permissive and dangerous space that has, you know, produced all of the, when people dress up as a Halloween pirate, they're basically dressing up in drag. Like that's part of the dress of pirates, is that bright color, the ostentatiousness of that is a form of drag as well. So yeah, they're really cool to explore from a queer perspective. Also, because a bit like the Vikings, pirates are a group of people that have often been seen as like hyper masculine. And the idea of that is that these are, you know, strong warriors. All of them are men, no women, and, you know, definitely not queer. They weren't a bunch of pansies. And the reality is so much more interesting.
So fantastic. I really think that it is interesting that, you know, we talk about like creating queer spaces, especially in like modernity and stuff like that. And the idea that like pirates were creating queer spaces, but it wasn't like a safe queer space. You know, it was like, you can exist here. However, it is fucking dangerous, the thing that we're about to do. Like the place that you find yourself is dangerous, but it's also worth it because you're finding community in a certain way, and it's better than what you're fleeing from.
I think this is I'm a queer historian, and I want to create connections, particularly for younger queer people, where they can go, hey, people like me have always existed, and the things I love are connected to me, and I'm allowed to own those. I love that. But I also have to pepper it with like a bit of stark reality, which is, you know, history doesn't care about your feelings, you know, any which way. It definitely was a much more queer space than we often talk about. But that a queer space doesn't equal a safe space at all. You know, in terms of being a pirate, right? It depended on your captain. Like, if your captain was a raging religious homophobe, you are going to be killed for sodomy. You're going to be thrown out overboard, or you're going to be abandoned on a desert island. Like, we actually have the diaries of a Dutch guy who was left on a desert island because he was accused of sodomy. And from what we can gather, he slowly runs out of water and food and dies. And it's a really tragic story, right? At the same time, you could find yourself in a permissive space where you, maybe as a queer woman, could explore all of this stuff freely and openly. I think we've got to be careful not to, like, I don't know, overly gild the lily. So make it all soft and fluffy, because that's not history either. There's a great book that I would highly recommend people that are interested in this kind of stuff to read, Bad Gays. And in it, they explore the fact that being queer doesn't make you a good person. Like, queer people come in every sort of flavor and form. And so sometimes, you know, the stories from the past, we existed, we sometimes did incredible things, we found each other, we found love, you know, we had sex, we did cool stuff, we created art. And also, we created terrible things, and we hurt each other, and we hid in spaces that were not safe. And it's as rich as any other element of human existence. I use the analogy of flowers in the dark. So the idea is, when you grow a plant in a dark cupboard, it's, you know, going to grow different, and it's going to try and grow towards the light in any way it can. But sometimes the leaves can be yellow or a little bit twisted, or it doesn't grow completely straight and normal. And some of that can be beautiful and inspiring, but it also can mean that people do bad things, and they go to strange places, and they put themselves or other people in danger because there was no way to exist safely as themselves. So I think that's the thing with pirates. They are a great illustration of that, you know, queer spaces aren't safe spaces necessarily. And you can find amazing stories there, but also, like, you come across Anne Bonny and you're not on her side, she will shoot you in the face. Yeah. Right? She's a murderer.
100%.
She's also kick-ass and probably partly mythologized, but she's also a murderer. So you've got to balance all those things at the same time.
Queer rights and queer wrongs, we stand for them all here on Spirits.
I would love for everyone to go ahead and look at Bad Gaze. And I would also love for everyone to go and order a copy of Queer as Folklore. Sacha, where can people find that and also your work online?
Thank you so much for the shameless plug. My agent would be very happy. So Queer as Folklore is being published by Unbound. So you can find the publisher if you search Unbound, or if you just search Queer as Folklore. My name is Sacha,
Always.
Sacha. You'll find a copy and you can pre-order that. It is now also starting to appear on Amazon, which is very exciting. And we have also got an American, sort of North American distributor. So it will also be going out there as well. I will just say this annoying plug. This is the first book I've ever written, and so it is quite scary to do this marketing thing. But pre-orders do matter because when the book actually releases, which is in the UK, will be August 22nd, and in America, it will be in the fall. We need to convince bookshops and places that people actually want to read it. And the way they do this is literally looking at pre-orders. So if you fancy it and you know, this sounds like your thing, it's got some really cool illustrations, by the way. I'm just going to plug it there.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm so excited. I'm really excited. But also, whilst I'm saying this, I'm also terrified. Like, read it. But like, if you don't like it, please don't tell me.
Yeah. Keep it to yourself. And if you love it, at Sacha on Twitter or Instagram. And don't worry, you're already on bookshop.org, which is the
Sacha Downspace Coward.
There you go. You're already on bookshop.org. So you know that the book is going to be at spiritspodcast.com/books for folks to pre-order from their local independent bookstore in North America now.
Or if you just scroll down to the show notes of this episode, you can find a link to it and
There
just
you go.
pre-order it right now. So easy. Put in your credit card information. Just do it.
So easy.
Sacha, thank you so much for joining us. We are so glad to have you on the show to talk about all this queer folklore stuff. It's such our jam. So thank you so much.
Thank you too. I could talk for 15 hours. So yeah, thanks a lot for having me.
Absolutely. And remember, next time you're time traveling as a queer person through history, stay creepy.
Stay cool.